Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And probably the most important update is coming from Krynky, and this is probably not even the most important update of today, but even of entire January and 2024. According to information we have, according to the Russian sources, they managed to break the Ukrainian defense belt in Krynky and to force the Ukrainians to withdraw their positions in the village. First update we got somewhere at 6 p.m. of the local time, and according to that update, the Russians managed to establish Russian flag in the central part of the village. But it was very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians were talking about, where exactly the Russians managed to establish the flag. Later, an hour later, we got update from another Russian source somewhere at 7 p.m. of Moscow time that Krynky hasn't been cleared yet, that there are still Ukrainians, that the Russians managed to establish the flag, but not like it doesn't mean that the entire Krynky fell. It's just like another part of the village was recaptured by the Russians. Later at 7:20 we got the approximate place where exactly the Russians managed to establish the flag, and this is the area where the flag was raised by the Russians. So once again, at least according to text messages and text updates, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to cut another piece of pie from Krynky foothold. But this is not the last update. The important update we are getting from Syriac map, who confirms that the Russian army was able to capture more areas of Krynky as the Ukrainian army started the withdrawal from the last urban area under its control, which is under the gray zone. During the next hours, extended that the area will be cleared by the Russian troops. So the battle for Krynky has ended. Maybe not right now, maybe has already ended, but we will receive these updates in upcoming morning. That was a very long and very difficult battle for both sides, either for the Russians and the Ukrainians. And after 4 or 5 months of clashes, the Ukrainians were completely defeated. And not just the Ukrainians were completely defeated. The most important thing, the most important achievement of the Russian forces is that they managed to defeat and completely collapse the Ukrainian forces of the 35th Marine Brigade, one of the most powerful, well-experienced army in the world, even in the world. 37th Marine Brigade also was defeated, 38th Brigade also in the same line, and of course 36th Marine Brigade. All these brigades recently, before the Krynky offensive operation, were redeployed from Avdiivka tactical bridgehead after very heavy clashes for for cities like Urozhaine and Staromayorsk. They were redeployed, and after a very short pause, the Ukrainians start sending the Ukrainian Marines to Krynky. And during the first days, first weeks of that clashes, the Ukrainians managed to develop a very big foothold in this area. I'll remind you that according to geolocations, correct me Israel if I'm wrong, this is the maximum foothold the Ukrainians were able to hold inside of the village during this battle. But later the Russians start using FAPs, and if you remember, the Ukrainians managed to concentrate up to 1 battalion inside the village, and so we are talking about 400 soldiers. But after the Russians start using FAPs, the number of Ukrainian forces was reduced till 100, and today on the 17th of January we start receiving that the last soldiers of Ukrainian forces who managed to survive those 4 months or 5 months of bloody clashes took a decision to run away, to escape, and basically to save their lives. Now it's very important to understand how did it happen, how did the Russians manage to take control, restore control over Krynky, why did they manage to do this, and the thing is, why the Ukrainians took a decision to withdraw their positions just today. Why haven't they make this decision, let's say, in the end of December, or why haven't they make this decision yesterday or 2 months ago? Why the Ukrainians were continuing clashes and keeping hope that they can do and they can establish or develop this foothold? If we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of January, probably it will give us some answer, at least a part, some questions will be with answer, will receive the answer. And the most important thing that Ukrainians, as an arsenal, as a type of weapon they had during the battle for Krynky, were just FPV drones. Those were the only things that Ukrainians were able to use to slow down the Russians. And of course, FPV drones is nothing in comparison with the batch or with the number of types of weapon that the Russians had in their arsenal. The Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainians with FPV drones as well. The Russians destroyed during the previous week significant number of boats, and according to some sources, just 50 or 60% of the personnel that started their movement somewhere from Avdiivka were able to reach the Krynky foothold itself. The rest 50% sank somewhere in the rivers and left somewhere between the islands. Furthermore, significant number of Ukrainian forces were destroyed on the Ukrainian bank of the river because the Russian drones were flying in this area, either controlling the territory, controlling the landing process, and the most important, controlling the bases and the places of FPV drone operators, because there are not so many places where the Ukrainians can use the areas as FPV drone bases. The distance of drones is limited. If we calculate, let's say, the distance between Krynky and let's say this area, let's say Ivanovka, the distance between these 2 points is around 4 kilometers. So obviously the Ukrainians didn't have any possibilities to keep their FPV drone operators very far from the combat line, let's say somewhere in Tokarivka or among the fields, because basically the drones wouldn't be able to get Krynky. So that's why the Ukrainians lost not just the most powerful and experienced marine brigades, they lost the most important assets of this war as FPV drone operators. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing not just the river, not just the boats, not just the shore bank of Ukrainian river. The Russians suppressed and destroyed significant number of artillery forces with lancet strikes. Dozens and dozens and tens of artillery systems were destroyed as a result of Russian lancet strike. Significant number, significant losses, and very, very big failure of Ukrainian forces in this area. And we understand now why the Russians were trying to keep this area as long as possible, because this situation completely fit Russian requirements. The Russians managed to defeat not just Ukrainians, they managed to defeat their Ukrainian minds, showing them that this is disaster. I can't even imagine what kind of media effect the loss of Krynky will affect on the Ukrainian society, and not just on Ukrainian society, the most important on the Western sponsors and Western partners of Ukraine. But once again, we still haven't received an answer why the Ukrainians took a decision to start evacuation right now. And probably, of course, we just discussed a lot of factors like complete Russian superiority, and obviously this is like the 60 or 70% of the reason why the Ukrainians took a decision to withdraw their position. The second one is that Ukrainians basically lost significant number of manpower, obviously more than 5 or even 6,000 of soldiers the Ukrainians lost during the battle for the foothold. But as I understand, the final point why the Ukrainians took a decision to withdraw and basically to run away from the village is, of course, very low temperature. -20 on Celsius below zero. It's obviously very, very bad conditions for any foothold. We just yesterday discussed, if you remember, the video that describes the situation the best way. On this video we can see that all the rivers between the islands, Kazachila, Gerska, Konka, all the small rivers are completely were covered with ice, and it reduced the Ukrainian logistic till zero from starting of probably yesterday or day before yesterday or at the beginning of this week. The Ukrainians lost any possibilities to support their forces in Krynky. They had possibilities just to move along the Dnieper River. But the question, why the Ukrainians took a decision to wait for so long, why they haven't started their withdrawing process right after we got this ice on the river and so on, because today we got a lot of updates and we continue receiving that the Russians are pushing. It's not like just a thing that the low temperature came and the Ukrainians took a decision to withdraw. No, there is like a lot of factors, and of course the most important is that the Russians continue their offensive operation. The Russians were attacking from the forest, from the south, from the east, from the west, from every single direction, and this is the reason why the Russians managed to also to increase the Ukrainian losses. But once again, the question is why the Ukrainians took a decision to withdraw their positions just today. Just now they're running away from this village. And as I understand, the answer to this question is very simple. The thing is that the only way how the Ukrainians can get Krynky and to evacuate from Krynky are boats and the rivers. And when talking about boats, like 70 or 80% of boats of the boat were destroyed as a result of FPV drone strikes. But when the cold came, most of the boats stuck in the river between the ice, and this reduced any possibilities for any logistic in this area till zero. So this is the second reason, and the most important one is that the thing is that, as I understand, the final decision to withdraw positions from Krynky were made not by the Ukrainian commanders. The final decision to start running away from this foothold was made by the soldiers on the ground. And the thing is that when the boats came to Krynky, supply boats came to Krynky, most of them were destroyed by the Russians somewhere in the area of the Krynky shore, somewhere here. So the Ukrainians had possibilities, let's say 10, 20, 30% were able to get there, but then they were destroyed by the Russians. And basically those who got on Krynky hadn't possibilities to evacuate. And the only thing that Ukrainian soldiers were waiting on this foothold is very, very deep minus. It's maybe unlogic from the first side, but from the other side, I understand that the soldiers, when they saw and when they realized that the river got freezed, they realized, the soldiers in Krynky, who were always every single day under Russian fire of TOS flamethrower systems, as under fire of FPV drones, of guided bombs, of Lancet strikes, when they at one morning they woke up and realized that the river is freezed, and now they don't need any boats and they can just start running away to the, let's say, Tyaginka, to this bank of the river. They basically just started doing this without waiting for any order from Ukrainian side. And they did this, and now they're just running away till Dnipro. Of course, there are very high chances that Ukrainians from this bank of the river will not help them, but I think that they will, because it's Marine brigades. It's like they're like one big family, and obviously this upcoming night, when the cold is going to get its lower level, it's going to be up to -20. They will start evacuation Ukrainians from one bank of the river to another, and obviously this is maybe also a normal weather for reducing of Lancet and FPV drone strikes. So this upcoming night is going to be the most important, and obviously the Ukrainians will finish the battle, and once again not as a result of command of Ukrainian authorities. Basically the weather, the bad weather and freezed river allowed the Ukrainians in Krynky to make a decision by themselves and to run away while there is a possibility. And now the most important question and the most important thing that we need to discuss: what kind of benefits the Russians managed to get as a result of clashes for Krynky, and what kind of benefits, if there are benefits, managed to get Ukrainians. First, let's start from the Ukrainians, because the answer to this question is very simple. The Ukrainians haven't managed to get anything. They lost 4 Marine brigades in this area. They were completely defeated. And when talking about the Russians, of course, every single Ukrainian negative effect of the battle is the biggest Russian benefit. And there is one important additional benefit for the Russians. And I'm talking about the thing that during the 4 or 5 months clashes for this foothold, the Russians lost significantly less soldiers in comparison with the Ukrainians. And as I understand, the Ukrainians during the battle for Krynky lost probably up to maybe 4 or 5 or 6,000 soldiers soldiers. It's a very big army, and the Russians probably lost maybe a few hundreds, because it's like, obviously it's a normal ratio due to the geolocations we saw, because the Ukrainians were losing their soldiers everywhere. But you might say, of course, yes, the Ukrainians were defeated, but the Russians managed to save the personnel. So, and what next? And the thing is that this is the beginning of entire collapse of Ukrainian defense. Why I'm saying this? Because now the Russians have opportunity, and very good opportunity and chances, to redeploy the saved army from Kherson, from Krynky, in direction of Rabotina, in direction of Bradley Square, because now the Russians have also reached the outskirts of the village, and just for the previous week we got 3 geolocations from inside of the village. Of course, we haven't seen even a single geolocation of clashes and, let's say, ground operation inside of the village, but the Russians have started the preparation. Today, for example, we got another video how the Russians started bombing the central part of Rabotina with TOS flamethrower system. This is the third evidence of the beginning of the storm operation of the village. And now imagine yourself, the Ukrainians don't have any possibilities to redeploy their defeated marine brigades to Rabotina, let's say, to hold the bridgehead, and the Russians do have possibilities to reinforce and to send on this foothold in direction of Rabotina up to 10,000 soldiers. Just imagine yourself that at once Rabotina foothold, Russian side, will get 10,000 soldiers. Obviously, the battle for Rabotina in this case will be finished within the next 2 or 3 weeks. And in this case, they're going to be completely the big ratio and between Russian and Ukrainian, or let's how to say, the number of Ukrainian forces, there are going to be no, let's say, superiority in the number of forces, neither from the Russian nor from the Ukrainian side. But the Russians may be even going to have more soldiers because of fresh reserves from Kherson. And this situation, the next, as I understand, this is going to be exactly like this. The next 3 or 2 months, weeks of clashes are going to be in direction of Rabotina. And the Ukrainians will also lose this battle because they will, and furthermore, the brigades like 117th, like 118th, 33rd, 65th, these brigades will be defeated by the Russians because of like complete difference and very big gap between the forces. The Ukrainians don't have reserves, and the Russians will bring the fresh forces from Kherson. And this is something like a snowball. As you can see, from one front line to another, this snowball is going to be increased, is going to increase and increase and increase. And due to the fact that the Russians managed to save the forces in Krynky and the Ukrainians lost 4 brigades, now the Russians have superiority on every single next foothold. They will send forces from one victory to another. Because when talking about Rabotina, you don't need to fight and you don't need to start, let's say, tens and dozens kilometers far from the village. The battle take place exactly inside of the village already. So you don't need to make a dirty job. You can just redeploy reserves and to finish this battle as soon as possible. And as I understand, this is going to take place probably maybe even at the beginning of this weekend or even at the beginning of the next week. Because it's exactly the time that the Russians need to redeploy forces from Kherson to Rabotina just to get tuned in the situation and to begin the ground offensive. After the Battle of Rabotina, that will take place probably the next 2 or 3 weeks after another loss from Ukrainian side because of problems with reserves, the Russians will be able to redeploy their, let's say, also another gap of forces from this front line probably to the South Donetsk direction. And as I understand, there are going to be no clashes for Velika Novoselovka foothold because the Russians during the previous months, 2-3 months, haven't made even a single, let's say, episode of any preparation for further counteroffensive. So if you want to attack, first you need to make preparation. We saw preparation in Rabotina. Now we see something like military preparations in Novomikhailivka. So that's why, as I understand, after the clashes in Rabotina, after the Russians will successfully complete that battle, they will redeploy the forces and reserves from that battle, it's going to be the second battle, to Novomikhailivka, because on this direction the Russians also continue advancing and they're moving from Solodki in direction of Vadiana. Today we got another video of a heavy bombing of Ukrainian positions somewhere among the fields in triangle in the square between Vadiana, Volodymyrovka, Solotka and Novomikhailivka. The Russians are very serious to penetrate Ukraine's defense belt and to collapse this area. And if you remember, just a few days ago we were talking, but before that, once again, according to some mappers, the Russians by 17th of January have already established control over this territory. And if you remember, a few days ago we were talking about the Russian speed, about the Russian progress and how fast they are moving from Solotki, Stepnoye in direction of Vadiana and the road TO524. And if you remember, I told you the approximate, like not dates but approximately timings, and I told you that probably according to this speed the Russians will be able to get this line to establish control over these additional, let's say, 3 lines in the forest lines within the next 3 or 4 weeks. That was my words, and this is exactly these timings completely correspond with possible duration of battle for Robotyne, because the battle has already started. Now if the battle of Krynky finished, the Russians will redeploy reserves, they will fast finish the battle for Robotyne, and then they will send the reinforcements to Novomikhailivka and South Donetsk direction. And by the Russians are able to get this line and to get as close as possible to the main supply road, the Russians in this sector will get some reinforcement from Robotyne and from Kherson direction. And this is going to be the third battle, and this is going to be another layer for the snowball that continue growing and growing. I can't tell you whether the Russians are able to achieve this progress so significantly, and whether they are able to continue increasing of this snowball. Maybe the Ukrainians will find a solution how to get reserves, but anyway, if the Ukrainians are going to send reserves, let's say from the border with Chernigov or Sumy area, then they're going to have a hole in their defense, and the Russians obviously will use this opportunity to enter completely unprotected positions from Ukrainian forces. If the Ukrainians will remove their forces, let's say from Kupiansk direction, then the Russians will be able to achieve significant results on that direction. The situation, you need to understand that with the loss of Krynky foothold, the situation for the Ukrainians is got the maximum critical level. Now, just a single case, a single luck can determine the entire situation. On this video, for example, we see another clashes for the village by the name of Nivoyska, another offensive operation from the Russian side. So we see that there is also some activity. Now we are moving to Avdiivka direction. According to information we have, the Russians continue attacking, and today we got very interesting report that since this morning the Russians have already launched up to 30 guided bombs inside of the citadel. The Russians probably started or launched another artillery or aviation preparation. We need to expect within the next few days a very heavy offensive operation on this side as well. From this territory we got just one interesting geolocated video how the Ukrainian soldiers were evacuating their forces along this tree line. As you can see, this is a very big stronghold on Stepovo-Berdych direction. On this video we can see how the Ukrainian tank arrived right in front of Russian positions and start bombing and attacking Russian forces in the trenches from the very short distance. First I was wondered what was the purpose of Ukrainian tank, but later we got the episode when Ukrainian soldiers somewhere from the same area, let's say, went on board of the tank and they started evacuation. So this video shows us this following situation. The Ukrainian tank arrived something like this. From this position, the Ukrainian tank started bombing and attacking the Russian forces in the trenches, like he was attacking, the tank was attacking, something like this. And when the Ukrainian infantry sat on board of the tank left this territory, and probably the Russians managed to continue offensive operation further along the trenches. So this is the first geolocated video confirming the Russian progress on this territory. Now we are moving to Avdiivka, Bohdanivka direction, and probably the most important update is coming as usual from Bohdanivka itself. And the Russians are saying that this night, the previous night, the Russians were concentrating their forces before the final battle for the forest that located to the northwest of Bohdanivka. So maybe right now, maybe this moment, maybe these seconds, maybe while you're watching this video, the Russians launched the most massive offensive operation in direction of this sector. This is the, as you can see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 strongholds on the hill, and the Russians took a decision to storm these strongholds this night. Very difficult to understand what is going to happen, whether the Russians are able to capture this territory or not. But if we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of January, we're gonna see that the Russians during the previous months work hard. They, as you can see, they were bombing, they destroyed every single fire positions, ammo depot, warehouse, trenches when they fire, the supply roads when they fire, FPV drone operator base. So they destroyed and reduced as many as possible Ukrainian assets in this area, and they launched an offensive operation to Bohdanivka. So we'll see. Obviously the next morning or the next evening will bring us more update about the attack on this direction. When talking about Kupiansk-Liman, we haven't received a lot, just interesting updates are coming from Kupiansk direction. To be more precise, the Ukrainians announced 2 evacuation zones. The first evacuation was announced in Kupiansk itself. There are still a few thousands of people in this area. The Ukrainians took a decision to move them as fast as possible, and because they're expecting for the worsening of the situation. And the same story we received from the borderlands. The Ukrainians announced once again, because if you remember, somewhere in September, October, the Ukrainians have already announced of evacuation, and they have evacuated more than half of population. But now they took a decision to do another wave, because not everyone was evacuated during the previous one. And the final updates are coming from Kharkiv. If you remember, yesterday we discussed and we're watching the video of Russian strikes inside of Kharkiv. We got during the previous night with Iskanders and or S-300 missiles, very difficult to understand. We see the ruined building, we see the Ukrainian security, rescue team was trying to handle with the crisis, and lether we got the video from during the daylight. The building was completely reduced and destroyed, as you can see, and later, the entire day after, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that on the evening of 16th of January, Russian Federation attacked Kharkiv with missiles, and as a result of that attack, they managed to destroy the temporary position of Ukrainians, not Ukrainians, of French volunteers or mercenaries, what is best for you. And later they added that as a result of strikes, the Ukrainians lost 60 French volunteers mercenaries, and up to 20 were wounded and were moved to the hospital. So this is the situation in Kharkiv, and we see that the Russians continue the process of escalation process here with the purpose to start offensive operations sooner or later. When talking about Kiev and Zelensky himself, of course, today he talked a lot. We have already discussed the possible security agreement with France that will be signed in February. We have updated that Germany is going to send another military aid to Ukraine, and we have updates the video how Zelensky was interviewed. Very difficult video, but he told few interesting things, and they're interesting, at least for me, because they give me possibility to understand what Zelensky lives with, what happens is in his minds, and where the Ukrainians are going to. And according to him, if you are of mobilization age, you should be in Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine, not in Canada or in United States of America. This is a fact. And then you will fight or not fight. You will work. You cannot rest. You either work or fight. Later, I changed a little bit his phrase. Basically, Zelensky tried to tell us, if you're on the territory of Ukraine, there are two things. Or you are fighting, or you are already dead. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.